Hello, everybody. My name is Liam Cavanaugh, and this is a short presentation about contemplative citizen science, just to introduce people to the idea, or particularly our ideas. By that I mean the Sangha at Plum Village, and particularly Brother Phap Lin and I, who've been thinking about this as we've organized neuroscience retreats. Before going into that, a little bit about me. I have a long-standing interest in understanding social reality, mind systems, and institutions, and spent 6 years working as a researcher in applied economics and social policy. I did a PhD in UCSD where I focused on various aspects of embodied cognition and decided to work on cultural and institutional activism in 2016. After becoming aware of the advanced state of global warming. And so I would put my interests or describe my interests and those of the organization that I've co-founded, Life Itself, as contemplative activism, which is an activism motivated by an impression that Western culture has sort of a contemplation-shaped hole in it. Okay. And the outline of this talk is just to discuss really briefly Plum Village neuroscience retreats, some points of harmony and tension between scientific and contemplative endeavors, and then the prospects of building rafts together. Okay. So Plum Village neuroscience retreats are follow-up of some retreats that Thich Nhat Hanh had led in the past. We've gotten more regular recently after his stroke inspired more interest in the community about neuroscience, and which has in turn led to deepened understanding of trauma and its importance for meditators. Obviously, people who suffered trauma sometimes have difficulty with meditation. We have an interest in science. The Sangha has a curious interest in science, and in the suffering of scientists. Science is a particular community, as well as an understanding that science interprets teachings for the public, Buddhist teachings, whether we like it or not. And so the best route probably is to engage with scientific community. And so, and as well, we really do believe that collaboration between scientists and contemplatives could change the world in a real way, deepening our understanding of our own minds. Here's a video of Antoine Lutz presenting at our most recent neuroscience retreat, which was in June. Okay, a short bit about trauma. Trauma is useful for understanding of trauma is useful for understanding the difficulties that beginning meditators might have, as well as advanced meditators. Even trauma can be bumped into at all sorts of times. Basically, trauma might allow us to reach people that Buddhism has been unable to reach before. There's a famous section of the Pali Canon in which the Buddha tells the bhikkhus that he can't help some people and they don't quite believe him. So then he tries and is unable to, and all present are convinced that the Dhamma is not able to reach people of essentially who have some soundness of mind, who don't have rather some soundness of mind already. And trauma then sort of allows the ability to expand the number of people that contemplative communities might be able to reach. And a real lesson from that, and why I wanted to outline it, is that alleviation of suffering draws the interest of contemplatives. The neuroscience retreat on trauma was very well received and really got the community a lot more interested in science than it had been up until that point. And so that's worth, noticing. Okay, and then at the same time, science is an influential subculture, very special. PhD programs sort of introduce people to a very particular way of being. Michael Polanyi actually invented the concept of implicit learning, sort of like unconscious, you could call it, learning, to describe the communication of science within the research community. And so it's quite a deep thing. And Buddhism has always adapted new cultures and new practices. And so the Sangha is really like interested in that. I can't say more about it in the time constraints, but that's part of the collaboration. And finally, you can see science as kind of like the reincarnation of the modern era. What do I mean by that? Well, reincarnation was sort of part and parcel of the culture in which Siddhartha Gautama existed. And pointing skillfully towards the truth in his time required using it. And science is just as much part and parcel of Western culture now. And gesturing towards the truth of that Buddhism is meant to gesture towards, the truth of life, may require science in our cultural context. Okay, so then moving on to building rafts together. Okay, I'll explain more about what I mean by that in a moment, but for now, I'll talk about points of harmony between contemplative and science. And one is open-mindedness, a spirit of inquiry, and an interest in furthering human well-being. And this has been a lot discussed under the rubric of Buddhist modernism, to the point, the accusation being that, which is true in spots, that Buddhism is presented as a science or totally consistent with science, etc. But not following Thompson every last point. Broadly though, there are also points of tension, regardless of what you think science should be or science as practiced. There are tensions, particularly what is the point of inquiry, predictive theories, or alleviation of suffering. Lack of maybe investigation of what the difference might be. Very, very different views about the role of intellectual works in the alleviation of suffering. Is it to create technologies or drugs that can change the mind, or providing rafts to cross to the other shore, right? The other shore being the extinction of grasping, right? And therefore of concepts, which is part of nirvana. Okay. And so that kind of explains what I mean by rafts, or gets us started. What is the scientific stance towards Buddhist tradition? Well, there's two ways it could be seen. You could see it as a religion, which is largely and fundamentally about irrational devotion to perceived beliefs. It can certainly be dogmatic, but does that separate it from other disciplines? Or it can be a tradition of inquiry into the nature of suffering and existence, with a history of devotion equal to that of any other tradition, including science, but with an unorthodox methodology by some standards, which would include, to push the envelope, that morality is almost part of the investigation. Like, you can't have the instrument of investigation, right, a clean mirror, as we would say in Buddhism, without observing morality. That, gets you into rather deep conflicts with science as practiced. Okay, so what has Buddhism done intellectually, though? It's provided followers with all sorts of conceptual rafts for thousands of years, right? And this is kind of the Buddhist approach to or view of, if you would like to say, concepts, that they are sort of they can provide us rafts that can be grasped, right, for a while we are on choppy seas, that we can hold on to sort of wholesomely, and help us cross to another shore, where we realize that grasping overall heavily at anything is a source of suffering, including the concepts of the Dhamma. because as soon as we grasp them and make them true, they're sort of no longer true. They've become substitutes for real truth, right? So it's not what science believes, right? And just to give a more basic introductory example of rafts, we can go to the Four Noble Truths, the first rafts, the subject of the Siddhartha Gautama's very first Dhamma talk, which are one, that suffering is innate in human life, that it has a cause, that the cessation of suffering is the cessation of this same cause, or which is craving and aversion, and that there's a way, to accomplish this cessation. Okay, so if you just look down the status of these on the right here for you, the first, that life is full of suffering, is sort of always accepted intellectually, but not, how should we say, we sort of we got it, but we don't want it. It's difficult to accept. Suffering has a cause, it arises together with attachment and craving. Not really proven. Yes, there are some, a few studies that have been shown, but this is a strong claim. All suffering arises with attachment and craving. A few studies showing a correlation is very different from showing that cessation of suffering is possible, right? So first, before getting to the cessation of suffering is possible, we have to show that all suffering is caused rather, or co-arises with attachment and craving. And that's still unproven. So some other rafts that we might think of proving would be action through inaction, so that we can kind of do things without taking action, which is a sort of a grasping within the Buddhist worldview. It always comes up when you start advocating non-attachment, extinction of conceptual prediction and bliss, and many others could be added. And so a summary of the situation briefly is that science is interesting, has overlap with Buddhism, but many contemplatives are wary of giving scientists more authority on inner life. And scientific materialism is thought to be a reason why meditation is taboo, but it's hard to draw a straight line between any particular study and the release of that. So how science can be part of that particularly is difficult to say. And another reason why contemplatives are wary is that the mere engagement with science can be sort of disruptive to practice. At the same time, studies on mindfulness have allowed many to take refuge in the practice, to engage in it with enough solidity that they have a chance to be convinced that there's something there, right? So we can call that taking refuge, right? Giving it a fair trial. So what can come of this? Contemplatives are deeply trusted by well-resourced and influential practitioners. They would be capable of organizing participants quickly, but this could all be done by contemplatives who can steer their own ship. That means having the resources to study the kinds of questions that tradition point towards strongly. And that can create opportunities for mindful scientists